Okay, so by way of brief introduction, my name is Koi Patra. I'm with the Ohio Department of Education. I'm going to be one of the people presenting to you today. I'm going to give people a couple more minutes to come in, but I wanted to make sure that everybody is seeing my first slide screen.
I see it.
Okay. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and start. I just wanted to welcome everybody to the developing items for assessment using the Ohio State test model. I hope that your day is going well, that you've been able to enjoy the all digital, all wonderful regional data lead convening so far. If you're having technical difficulties, go ahead and note those in the chat and we'll try to get that taken care of. Likewise, if you have any questions about the presentation, please add them to the chat as well. Because of my setup with my laptop at home, I'm not able to view the questions and present simultaneously, so those might have to wait till the end. But I think we'll probably have more than enough time to provide any answer to anything that we have an answer for. So I'm going to give a very brief introduction. Like I said, my name is Koi Patra. I'm an education program specialist with the Ohio Department of Education, working in the Office of Assessment, primarily in an assessment development lead role, which means that I am the department's go-to lead assessment developer for ELA grades 3 through 6, and then the science assessments for the OSTs. Kurt, you can go ahead and introduce yourself.
Okay, by way of a brief introduction, my name is Kurt Talby. I also work in the Office of Assessment at ODE. My primary role is that of a psychometrician, which means I spend most of my time playing with numbers, which means you are my people. Most of my time I spend not only with the Ohio State tests, but also with our alternate assessment for students with cognitive disabilities, and the OELPA and OELPS, the tests we use to screen and measure English language learners in Ohio. So I will be joining later. My part of this presentation is relatively late in the deck, so I will turn it back over to Koi.
Okay, thanks a lot. So just to start, I wanted to give a brief explanation for why we're here at this specific seminar. And that reason is to have a kind of walkthrough through the 2-year-long process by which the Ohio State tests, the OSTs, which I'll be referring to them as, are developed. I think by itself, this wouldn't be the most advantageous use of your time, since it's kind of an in-house, behind-the-scenes thing. So I'm going to try to place this process in a more familiar context of how instructional and assessment materials are developed more generally, including locally and at the district level, so that we can, moving forward through the presentation, kind of imagine this as a framework to develop assessments and assessment systems locally. So one of our first learning goals is to understand the process by which test items are developed, which I pretty much just explained. The second learning goal is to identify how data can inform decisions during the item writing process, especially as they're developed, revised, and finally implemented on an operational form. Now, historically, the term data analysis has always privileged quantitative data. Like if you think back to the opening meeting of this convening, what people were referring to when they mentioned data analysis or data more generally was quantitative data. And that's numerical data that's generated and can be placed on a scale. However, I want to recognize, first and foremost, the very important role which qualitative data plays, especially in an educational setting. Too often, qualitative data, which is the unscaled, non-numeric data represented in research philosophies like ethnographic research, phenomenological research, subjective interviewing research. Too often that's treated kind of like a red-headed stepchild in the academic and scientific world, but it is genuinely the primary method by which data is gathered and analyzed in the day-to-day practice of the classroom. Like, there is no more analytical profession than that of the teacher and those professionals who support him or her. I've worked plenty of jobs in the private and public sector, and it's not even a competition. Educational professionals analyze more data than actual data analysts, and teachers especially are making data-driven decisions on a minute-by-minute basis. One of the goals today, the second goal, is to kind of draw out those implicit data-driven analyses that are being made and make it clear that it really is data that is driving those decisions. And then the third one, I'm hoping that we can analyze how the item writing process can be adapted for use at the classroom and district level, which is something that I already mentioned earlier, because the framework that we're going to be discussing isn't just the Ohio State test model. It's the model that's used largely for most standardized tests that are published today, and generally, in a very basic way, for any kind of product development, not just educational products. So this can be scaled up and scaled down. You can use the parts that you want. You can get rid of the parts that maybe you don't want or that you can't use given the size and the scope of the project you're trying to apply it to. It all depends, but it's a nice framework to sort of understand the assessment development process. So briefly, to give context to what I mean by the forms of assessment, I want to place the standardized summative assessment items that appear on the OST in their appropriate categories by first discussing briefly the kinds of assessments that we have. So perhaps the easiest way to do this would be to place everything on a scale. We can call that scale the distance from instruction, a term that probably doesn't make sense immediately, but as we go through these three different forms of assessment, you'll kind of recognize what I mean by distance. The first form of assessment I want to talk about is formative assessment. Now, these forms of assessment are the closest to instruction, and in fact, they're referred to as formative instructional practices by the Office of Learning and Instructional Practices. They're not even referred to as formative assessments, by and large, because they're so intertwined with the instructional practice. One of the defining features of formative assessments is that they're timely. They happen concurrently with instruction or shortly thereafter, often taking the form of questions posed aloud to the classroom or to individual students. Like that form of brief, moment in time interactive assessment is a form of formative assessment. They're also instructional. They guide student learning and act as inflection points for both teachers and students to either change the way that they're teaching or on the students' part, change the way that they're learning. That being said, they're also collaborative between teacher and student. And they're frequently one of the few forms of assessment where students can direct the assessment activity. Like think about reflection journals and things like that. Those are formative assessments. Students write in them, reflect on what they learn and how they learn, and hopefully move forward using that data. And they don't have any formal evaluation purpose. Formal meaning that they're not used for grades. The second form is the interim assessment. Now, these are less frequent, typically given at the end of the day, the week, or sometimes the month in the form of quizzes, occasionally still homework and other graded assignments, but they don't happen on a moment-to-moment basis like formative assessment. They're also teacher-driven, which is the teacher creates them or occasionally guides the student herself in creating them, but they come from the teacher. And they do have a formal evaluation purpose. Like I said, grades are assigned. Finally, we have summative assessments, which is at the far end of the scale, distance-wise, from instruction. They are cumulative. They occur at the end of a chapter, end of a module, or end of the school year. And they evaluate students on what they've learned over an entire unit of instruction, kind of from nuts to soup. They have infrequent administration. When we talk about distance from instruction, we are talking about these do not happen every day or every month. They might happen once a year. They are very distant from instructional activity. And finally, they offer a certification of student learning. These are and tend to be the final say in whether a student has absorbed the material they've been given in the classroom. So those are the 3 forms of assessment. Of those forms, standardized tests would fall under the summative assessments, and that's true of the OST as it is of most standardized assessments. They have systematic scoring and administration to prevent bias and ensure validity, because we're talking about administering a test, especially with the OST, to an entire population of students across an entire state. And those students are individual students. So you need to approach it in a systematic way that isn't going to unfairly disadvantage or advantage any one student or any group of students in particular. And they are also a major certification of knowledge or skills of that target population, which is where the term high stakes testing comes from. They're often responsible for whether or not the student can graduate sometimes, or in the case outside of the OSTs, whether you get into the school you want to, whether like you could become a doctor, or there's a ton of licensed professionals out there who have to take some form of standardized test. And so it is very important that everything is systematic and administered appropriately. Okay, so Ohio State Test specifically is an instrument that certifies students on Ohio's learning standards. It's administered to elementary, middle school, and high school students, and it's developed by the Ohio Department of Education in collaboration with Cambium Assessment, formerly American Institutes for Research, who you might be familiar with. There is a 2-year-long development process, beginning with an initial collaboration between ODE and Cambium Assessment to plan and develop the items. Then they're reviewed by Ohio stakeholders, which means every item that has ever gone on an OST has gotten in front of educators in the field. And I listed this as step 2, but in fact it happens multiple times, as you'll see throughout the process. Then after they've been reviewed and finalized, they are field tested on an operational form where students will see them. They won't count towards the student's final grade because they're still in the development process. And after that, we will take the information that we got from the students, conduct a data review, and then if the items are in fact good enough to be included in the pool, we will incorporate them into the pool. But before that, there is actually a preliminary step involved before all of that. In order to determine which items need to be developed, we first review the pool of available items, checking our standards coverage to see which standards need more items written for them. We check the depth of knowledge, cognitive demand availability of some of the items. We might be light on one DOK and heavy on another DOK. So that's something we take into account. We also look at item format. Is it a multiple choice, multi-select, interactive items? Like, do we have enough of those that the test isn't going to be monotonous? Like, it's not going to be all multiple choice. And then finally, we look at the item test statistics, which Kurt will be talking about a little bit later, to make sure that, for example, we have items that range from very easy items to very difficult items, which is important, for example, because students at the highest level of ability need correspondingly difficult items in order to measure what they learn. So before we get into it, I just want to re-emphasize that although I'm talking about Ohio State test specific, there is no reason why the framework for item development we use at the department needs to be a significant departure from what is being done in the field in terms of developing instructional units, instructional products, and assessment products. When it's done well, I think teaching is a collaborative process, not just between student and teacher, but between teachers and other professionals in the field. Very frequently, you hear about teachers in a building, sometimes across the district, sharing instructional materials amongst one another, something that they've found really does well with their students. This is especially true in, for example, science classrooms, where technological advances are happening at a breakneck speed, and it's practically required to maintain a collaborative network of peers in order to bring the best instructional practices to your students. My hope, given what we're talking about here, is that we can take this framework and use it to model the development of a strong data-driven process for building out the same kind of collaborative relationships between educators that they already have for instructional products. Like, bring that same collaboration to bear on assessment products. So the first step in the Ohio development model is ODE will work together to set development goals. And then the vendor, in this case Convening Assessment, will take a first crack at developing items based on the Ohio Learning Standards and the test blueprints. After that, we have revision of new items. ODE and the vendor work together to sort of review and revise the test items according to standard practices. So, for example, we might get an item back from Convening Assessment where the reading load is too difficult. We need to revise the language, bring it back, try again. And this is an iterative process that happens over several stages. Next, after we finalize the items, we start to get into our committee review. And this is where the items first get in front of Ohio stakeholders. And the first one of those committees is called the Content Advisory Committee. And this is where we take all of the items we've reviewed for this item development cycle. We put them in front of educators, and those educators will tell us whether they're valid and appropriate measures of the content standards for each subject area and grade level. The Content Advisory Committee, the CAC, is something that we actively try to recruit for, and which I think is a very valuable committee for an educator to serve on. So if you are out serving the field, you think that an educator or somebody in a district can benefit from having direct input into this process, you can direct them to me, and I will try to get them onto one of the committees. Because it is really beneficial to see that Ohio stakeholders are really driving a lot of the development process. The next committee that they'll go through is not just educators, but it's parents and community members who review and evaluate test questions to ensure that each question is fair, unbiased, and does not promote individual moral values. And this is the only committee that is actually statutorily required by the Ohio, I think, Administrative Code. Like, this committee essentially comes together to serve as a representative population of Ohio to make a determination about whether or not the items that we've developed are fair for Ohio students. And that is a very, very important job, because it is not easy as a single person developing items to make sure that an item is not going to unfairly disadvantage or advantage any one student. For example, students who are from urban districts are going to be different and come to the test differently than students who are from more rural districts. We do not want either one of those groups to be advantaged or disadvantaged. So we make sure that we have educators, not just educators, but community members from around the state who come in, look at the test items, and let us know if they think their students are going to be disadvantaged by these items. Then we field test the items. The items that we've developed go on an operational form, typically in the spring, where they are then looked at, used by students, and we take that data back. Then another committee of Ohio educators is arrayed, and they review the student responses and scoring guidelines for some of the open-ended questions. And they use a rubric to establish the range of acceptable responses for each question. So they are really they are at what I think most people would recognize the first step of the kind of data review process when it comes to developed items. They are looking at whether or not student scores are falling within an acceptable range. Sometimes with the more sophisticated item format types we have, students may respond to like a graphical input item in a different way than we would have anticipated, in a way that is nonetheless correct. And so it's important to get these student responses in front of educators who will then tell us, like, yes, this is something my student would have done. Like, they know the information, they are telling you this should count as a correct response. After that, the items are rescored so that we're being inclusive of correct responses, and we've weeded out incorrect responses, and the data is then compiled. And then we have the item data review. Items that perform well on the field test are accepted into the test bank. Items that perform poorly statistically are either removed or edited and repeat the entire 2-year development process. And so, Kurt, like, you are free to jump in here at any moment, because I have kind of lost track of what slide number I'm on. Is this you, or are you a later slide?
This is not mine yet, although you're getting very close to it. What's next?
Okay, so what we have next
Here we are.
These are yours.
That's
okay,
mine.
So I am going to now hand it off to Kurt, and he's going to talk to you a little bit about the kind of test statistics that we use when we're deciding whether or not an item is a good quality item that can be put onto an operational form. I just wanted to say really quickly, before I handed it off to Kurt, that a lot of these test statistics you might be familiar with. Some of them you might not be. But all of them, even if you're not using them in a kind of rigorous, standard-driven way, tend to reflect behaviors and an understanding of item performance that is just qualitative. They lead to qualitative decisions about the items. So I will go ahead and hand this off to Kurt, and he can tell you more.
All right, thank you. As Corey said, this is these statistics are essentially a way to reduce individual student level performance and their and everything that could imply to something, to a numerical summary that we can use to evaluate the items and to choose what best fits our needs on a particular test. The first point here is discrimination, and the hitting item discrimination first. First, what discrimination is. It's essentially the correlation between the score on an item and the score on the rest of the test. And ideally, that should be positive because students who do well on an item should also do well on the test as a whole. Note that an item score is often binary, 1 or 0, right or wrong, but it doesn't have to be. The concept is still the same. It's a correlation between item and test. Think of it this way. What would it mean if the students who answered an item correctly had the same average score on the rest of the test as the students who answered that item incorrectly? It would mean that this item was not helping us separate those who know the concept from those who don't. It wouldn't matter if the item was very easy, most students getting it right, or difficult, most students getting it wrong. The item is just not contributing anything from a measurement point of view, even if it is testing essential content, because it's not corresponding with the rest of the test and not separating the students who know the concept from those who don't. If the students who answer this item correctly do better on the rest of the test than the ones who answer incorrectly, then that item's discrimination would be positive, and that is what we want to see. That means that item is corresponding with the rest of the test, which, and by extension, with the performance of students as a whole. We want items. In all cases, we want the students who do better to do better on the test as a whole, to do better on individual items as well. But that doesn't always happen. If the students who answer the item correctly do worse on the rest of the test than the students who answer incorrectly, then that item's discrimination would be negative. That could mean anything from the item being miskeyed to the item is somehow misleading for the students who know the content very well. But in any case, it's adversely affecting the measurement of the test, and we don't want that. I'll talk a little bit about discrimination. Now, obviously, this applies only to multiple choice items because those are the only items that would have the students make choices between correct and incorrect responses, choosing a correct response out of a number. But for multiple choice items, we can also calculate discrimination distractors, which are the incorrect answers. And we would do that the same way as we would for the correct answer, which is what we've already done for item discrimination. Here, we would expect discrimination to be negative because, remember, the students who choose that answer should do worse than the group as a whole. That answer is wrong. If you chose that answer, you probably did worse on the test than the group as a whole. The group of the students who did not choose that distractor include all the students who got it right, as well as everyone who chose other wrong answers. So the correlation won't be as large in an absolute sense as for the correct answer because the students who choose that distractor will all have missed it. The students who do not choose it, some will have missed it, some will have gotten it right. So that correlation is not going to be as strong. But it should still be negative because the students who got the item right are the ones who did not choose that distractor. A positive distractor correlation could indicate that the answer is somehow defensively correct because the high-scoring students tend to choose it, or again, it could indicate the item is miskeyed. Briefly about difficulty, the basic measure of difficulty is the average score on the item. For a 1-point item, that's equivalent to the percentage of students answering it correctly. So if 78% answer it correctly, that is a very basic measure of item difficulty. But note that difficulty, as well as discrimination, and I didn't mention that point then, is affected by the sample of the students who take the item. Let's say 90% of students answer an item correctly. That could mean the item was either very easy or the students were very well prepared or both. If you gave the same item to a class of 5th graders and a class of 8th graders, the 8th graders would probably do better, but the item hasn't changed. The item is still the same. So to account for the interplay between student ability and item difficulty, many testing organizations, and I count ODE among that number, use a statistical methodology called item response theory, or IRT. The simplest IRT model is called the Roche model, and you may never hear that term again, but it's called the Roche model. And it models the probability of a correct answer as a function of the difference between student ability and item difficulty. Ability and difficulty can be placed on the same scale, and if the two are equal, that would imply a probability of 50%. Student is as likely to get it right as get it wrong. If ability is higher than difficulty, probability is greater than 50%. If ability is lower than difficulty, it's less than 50%. Earlier, we briefly touched on cognitive complexity, depth of knowledge, cognitive demand. We use various terms in various subjects. That does not always match the empirical difficulty of an item. It's possible, for example, for a straightforward recall item to be difficult if it tests the facts that students just don't know very well. Also, the distractors on a multiple choice item also impact the item's difficulty. Think of it this way. If I were to ask you to identify the 37th President of the United States, you would have an easier time if the options were Richard Nixon, George Washington, Andrew Jackson, and Franklin Pierce than if the options were Richard Nixon, John F. Kennedy, Gerald Ford, and Jimmy Carter. Finally, diff, or differential item functioning. That is a statistical measure of possible item bias. In diff, the performance of a focal group, female, Hispanic, African American, etc., is compared with the performance of a reference group, male or white, after accounting for overall differences in performance. So if girls do better than boys overall on the high school ELA2 test, we might expect girls to do better on every item on that test, but there will be differences across the items. There will be some that the girls do a lot better. There will be others that the boys actually do better. The items that deviate from the general pattern are the ones that will stand out in a diff analysis. And there are 3 points to be made about diff, and that'll be it for this slide. First, diff is a measure of possible item bias, not test bias. It identifies items that don't behave as other items do. So if all items on the test were equally biased, I don't know how you could ever do that, but if that happened, none of them would show diff. Diff is based on items that stand out from the pack. Second, diff can be positive as well as negative. It is possible for the focal group to do better than expected. And third, it is usually difficult to identify the reason for diff even when we identify it. Items that show diff are reviewed during item data review, and there is usually no apparent reason for the diff. I can tell you that just a couple of weeks ago, I was in an item data review session for the alternate assessment. Some of the items that we reviewed were flagged because of diff. And in no case could we figure out why that was so. The content was straightforward. There was nothing in the item that should disadvantage one group over another, and yet the item still showed diff. Remember that these items have already been reviewed by the Fairness Committee before they were field tested. And at this point, I will turn it back to Coy, and I'll see you in a couple more slides.
All right, thanks a lot. So what I wanted to do is briefly follow up the descriptions of the statistical analyses that Kurt just gave and say that this is something that teachers might rarely use in the classroom in a statistical sense, but it is a qualitative, subjective judgment that they typically apply to almost every assessment they do. As far as discrimination goes, for example, Kurt would be able to give you the exact formula for that statistically, and teachers might not use that, but they do look at items and tests or items, and they do, if they see an item that all the students who aren't performing poorly on the test are getting correct, and all the students who typically perform well on the test are getting incorrect, then they know that's a problem. Just qualitative subjectively without looking at the statistics. The same goes for difficulty. Like, they just know from their professional background that they need a test that has a wide range of difficulties in order to accurately measure all the students. And with differential item functioning, which is a little more difficult in terms of identifying groups of students who have an unfair advantage or an unfair disadvantage, that's something that they tend to see if they are doing, for example, an ELA test, and they see an ELA item that has like a Spanish cognate, for example. which Spanish students would probably pick up on just because or native Spanish speaking students would be more easily picking up on, not because they knew the word, just because they were familiar with Convening. So that being said, I'm going to continue on with the process. Okay, so after the statistics are reviewed, the items become available to be included on operational forms. And the items are then placed on those operational forms depending on the test blueprint, which if you go to the Ohio Department of Education website and in the top right-hand corner, enter into the search bar, test blueprint or test specifications, it will bring this up. This is public-facing material that you can use to get a deeper understanding of the test and maybe a deeper understanding of how to build tests yourselves. So we build the test with the newly developed items according to the test blueprint and the test specs. So building an operational form, this happens basically in two different ways. I will talk about what we do from the development perspective, and then Kurt's going to talk what we do from the tech perspective, psychometrician perspective. I make sure that the test is aligned with the test specification and blueprints. I review items with overlapping or redundant content, which again is the same thing that teachers would do in the classroom. You don't want two items that are asking the exact same question. You don't want an item that is like queuing another item, or you don't want an item that is maybe giving students a hint as to a different item's response, or that is eliminating a response in a different item. And then I also make sure that it's certified by an independent content review by somebody who hasn't been looking at the items. Like I've just spent 2 years looking at these items. I probably can't really see them objectively anymore, so I make sure that somebody else is reviewing them. Okay, and then this is Kurt's. He can go ahead and tell you what he looks at statistics-wise when building the operational forms.
Okay. Picking up with this, and this is going to sound very similar to what you heard just a few slides ago when I talked about the other statistics, but we'll go back to this. First, item difficulty. We want a range of item difficulty so that the test can measure effectively across a wide range of student ability. We really don't want very easy items, the ones that very few students miss, or items that are so difficult that most students have to guess. Those items don't contribute to effective measurement. But we do what we can. Given the requirements of the test blueprints and the items available for use in the item bank. Some item types and topics tend to be harder than others. Multiple choice items, for example, tend to be relatively easy because students can guess. If it was a fill-in item, there's really no way of guessing the items, guessing the answer. So students who don't know it will probably get 0 points on that item. If it's multiple choice, there is still a roughly 1 in 4 probability of getting the item correct, even if you knew absolutely nothing about the content. Second, discrimination. In general, we look for items with moderate to high discrimination. Again, depending on the pool of items available to fill the test blueprint, sometimes we have to use items that are less discriminating than we would really like. The limitations of the item bank are always a factor in building a test. And finally, the other data, that's really not important at this stage because the other factors, such as diff, such as fit with the Roche model, and I noticed one of you asked a question about item infit or outfit, those factors will have already been addressed when the items were evaluated at item data review. At the point of form building, those factors are really not on the table anymore. If the items fell down on those points, they might not be in the pool at all at this stage. Moving to the next slide. Okay, talking about building an operational form. First factor here is reliability. Reliability refers to the consistency of test scores. And there are many ways of measuring that, but the most common is internal consistency, which is based on how well the items correlate with each other. Now, recall that item discrimination was the correlation of items with the remainder of the test. So items that discriminate well will lead to high reliability. If we would expect the student's score to stay relatively constant if that student were tested repeatedly on a series of equivalent tests. According to classical test theory, which is what people used before item response theory, and it's still important in the field, a student's observed score consists of true score, which is the actual construct we're measuring, for example, mathematical ability on a math test, and error, which is a catch-all for every other source of variance, from the particular questions on a particular test to how the student was feeling on that particular day. True score and error are assumed to be uncorrelated, and error is assumed to be distributed normally around a mean of 0, so it is as likely to raise a student's score as lower it. You could just happen to get lucky that the test is hitting a topic you know well particularly hard. So as reliability can be thought of as the percentage of total score variance in a group of students attributable to difference in true score. The remainder is error. Now, if it was all error, if you had a test of random numbers, there would be no true score variation at all, and everything would be based on error. Of course, that's not what any of us do. The second part of this is consistency with the reference form. After we build a test form and we calculate the raw score to scale score conversion table, and remember, we can do this before we give the test operationally because all the necessary statistics are gathered when the items are field tested. The conversion table is compared to that of the reference form. We use the spring 2018 forms as reference. The basic and proficient cut scores have to be within 1 point of the basic and proficient cuts on the reference form. Accelerated and advanced cuts have to be within 2 points. Now, that seems arbitrary, but let's say we didn't do this. We can estimate ability with almost any set of items. But what would happen if the items on the current test form were significantly easier than those on the reference form? Well, then we would expect any student to earn more points on the easier form, but that doesn't mean that his or her actual ability is any greater. The conversion table and the cut scores would reflect the fact that the test is easier. So, for example, a student who earned 25 points on the reference form might be expected to score 29 on the new form. It's as if a football team were to play an easier schedule. The team would probably win more games, but it would be no better as a team. If it played a harder schedule, it would have a worse record, but it wouldn't be any worse in any absolute sense. And I will turn it back over now.
Okay, thanks so much. So we're basically at the end. I'm going to provide you with some additional resources really quickly here, which you aren't really going to be able to use or click on since I'm the one giving the presentation. But if you email me, and you'll see my email coming up, I will be more than happy to forward you all the resources you need, including anything I've referenced here. The testing portal is, you might be familiar with, is where you can find the test specifications, which govern the various item types that we use. It has the test blueprints, it has the content limitations and things like that. So it tells you exactly what we do to build the test. And then student practice resources, which are like the item release guides. So you can see the items that, all of the items that underwent this process. So I'm going to quit my screen share now, shortly after I ask any questions. Again, this is my email. It's coy.patra@education.ohio.gov, and Kurt's email is up there as well. And we would be more than happy to assist you with any of the questions that you have today, if we're not able to answer them right now. So let me look. Okay, so I have a question here, just looking at the bottom. Will the next science assessments, year 20 to 21, include nature of science items? So we are, it should be by spring. Like the COVID crisis has kind of thrown a wrench into all of our plans regarding exactly which tests will even be administered. But the plan was to have the nature of science stuff for these science assessments in there by the spring. Were there any other questions?
Hi, Coy and Kurt. This is Sam. I'm monitoring the chat. Kurt's answered a few of these questions. I just want to make sure that earlier ones were addressed here. Kurt, I think you just addressed the first question that Steve asked about questions that are being tested and don't count. Like, what do you say to people who believe the questions that are being tested and don't count impact the student score? I think you just responded to that one. And then, let's see. There was another one asked, what % of questions on a math test are DOK 2 or greater? Is it similar in ELA? I'm not sure if that one has been addressed yet.
Okay, so as far as the DOK and the cognitive demand for the tests, more information should be available on the test specifications, which will be coming out shortly. I don't think they're published yet. I know for science, the available blueprint, which again governs exactly what the test looks like, is going to start including the percentage of items for each category of the cognitive demand. So yeah, I hope that answered that question. I know that some of the revamped test specs are going to include specific, not instructions, but a specific detailing of how many items are at each level of the cognitive demand.
Okay, I think that all the questions that are in the chat have been addressed at this point. If I'm wrong, someone please speak up. And feel free. Yeah, I see we have other questions coming in the chat.
Okay. So yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's Cheryl. Cheryl also works at ODE as an assessment lead on math, and so you can see. Yeah, we've been making a good faith effort on the part of the different subjects to bring everything together in a uniform way. And I hope that's going to be reflected in the test specs that will be coming out for science, which will be more aligned with what you would expect for math. Like, we're trying to make sure that every subject has equal attention given to the various tests.
Excuse me, this is Steve. I'm going to just say my question orally because what I was trying to say is that when ELA does one thing in how they put standards out, science does something else, social studies does something else. It has nothing to do with you guys and what you do. It has to do with us trying to teach people to look at different things along. So that's what I was kind of referring to. Thank you for the questions, answering the questions. I appreciated it.
Sure. And so we are going to end here shortly, within the next couple of minutes. Like I said, please feel free to email me if you have any more questions, or if you want a link to any of the resources we've been talking about. I would be more than happy to provide them. I'm going to let everybody go now so that you can sort of take a break before you have to go to your next session at 1:30. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I really appreciate it, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.